Don't you want to see the face of the enemy? Kittai asked. No, I don't, she said, because then I might think they're human. And they're not human.
Dehumanization was actually kind of a new word to me before I decided to do the research for this video. Like, I knew of the concept, I had a vague idea of the word in my head, and I thought I was familiar with its effects to a degree. But I was wrong. I had no idea of the extent of its impact, of how its far-reaching tendrils are what maps out the endless trails of blood that define so much of our history. The quotes from the introduction are from The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang, a book that is the first in a trilogy by the same name about, you guessed it, the Poppy War, a fictional war that is pretty clearly inspired by like a specific real one. I've only read the first book in the trilogy so far, but it was incredible, and while it directly addresses the concept I researched for this essay, I wanted to approach this topic through the lens of media that is not specifically about war, but is mostly about othering and aggression and the bridges between two opposing sides of a conflict. So I'm just using the quotes for the opener, but that's it. There's something about the way Tokyo Ghoul and Avatar briefly touch on this topic without centering their stories around it that made it so much more interesting for me to research and write this. There are also two pieces of media that I'm quite familiar with and that I actually have varying levels of appreciation for, so I thought this would be fun. Depressing kind of fun, but... Tokyo Ghoul is a Japanese manga series written and illustrated by Sue Ishida that ran from 2011 to the conclusion of its sequel series, Tokyo Ghoul Re, in 2018. It was adapted into an anime in 2014. But I am not talking about the anime. I might use clips from it if they fit, just for anyone actually watching this visually so you're not like super bored, but I'm not talking about the anime here. And Avatar is a 2009 science fiction film, which at the time of me writing this is the highest grossing movie of all time. I think second highest if adjusted for inflation, something like that. Directed and written by James Cameron. Also here, I will be referring to only the first movie. Don't worry about spoilers for anything in the sequel because I can't spoil it because I have not seen it. Both these pieces of popular media, while telling two very different stories, deal with the concepts of rivalry and violent conflict, and the horrors we are willing to justify, and the atrocities we will allow ourselves to commit once we strip those we deem as the enemy, as the other, of their humanity. So this is a discussion of how they both chose to touch on these topics and how the storytelling is influenced by them, and the different ways in which these two stories approach a concept that still feels a little underexplored, especially for the starring role it consistently plays during humanity's darkest hours. I'm just going to do a really brief summary of both stories first, just as like a refresher so it's clear what's being discussed. This time it's going to be brief, for real, I mean it. Tokyo Ghoul follows Ken Kaneki, a 19-year-old college freshman who at the beginning of the series survives, like near death, in an encounter with his date by having ghoul organs transplanted into him, effectively turning him into a half-ghoul. In the fictional version of Tokyo the story is set in, ghouls are a species separate from humans, who must eat human flesh to survive. They also possess some extraordinary physical abilities, like rapid healing and kagune. It's defined as a predatory organ. In this universe, ghouls, for the most part, look exactly like humans, apart from their eyes turning like red and black in states of heightened emotion. So in the story, ghouls live among humans, hiding their identities while trying to find ways to survive. The original series follows Kaneki acclimating to life as a ghoul, or a half-ghoul rather, as he tries to grow accustomed to having to hide so much of himself to survive. Also, he's getting used to like the food thing. He eventually gets caught up in the power struggles between different ghoul factions while also trying to evade the CCG, the Human Organization. I don't know how to convey that I'm making like air quotes with my hands because I have a lot of air quotes in this script for some reason. Anyway, the air quotes Human Organization, whose sole purpose is to hunt down and exterminate all ghouls. Every single one of them, whether they have committed crimes or not. The original 14 books end with Kaneki losing his memory after a pretty brutal battle, after which he is taken by the CCG following said memory loss, where he eventually ends up training and joining them, while possessing no recollection of the person he was before. The sequel series, Tokyo Ghoul Re, picks up 2 years after the end of the first one. In it, we still follow Kaneki, now Hai Sasaki, an active member of the CCG who leads his own special squad, known as the Kuang Squad, made up of lower-ranked CCG investigators who were modified to have some ghoul abilities through a surgical procedure. They are often referred to as human test subjects. Basically, they're kind of at varying levels of turning into half-ghouls too. As the series unfolds, Hayes has a hard time balancing his loyalty to the CCG and his growing empathy for ghouls, which is not made any easier when he starts getting the memories of the person he once was back. See, wasn't that so quick? Avatar is just dances with wolves. In space! Okay, sorry, no, I'll summarize it for real. But I do want to mention up front that I might get like a little bit snarky about the writing here and there, like I just did, because I think that this movie's writing is just its weakest point, and it's the center of all my criticism for it. And I love writing, so I take that a little extra personally. The premise of Avatar is that in the future, humans have mastered space travel, I think. It seems like it, and are able to go on like expeditions to further moons and maybe to planets, I don't know, which basically just means that they have a lot more land to colonize. And you know, for all my criticism of the writing, I will say that the space colonization thing, spot on, just sounds just like us. So they go to Pandora to colonize it because they want a material named unobtainium, and of course they have to displace the indigenous inhabitants of the moon who actually like have a right to the land to get it. This is honestly kind of irrelevant to the summary, like especially the name, but it was just really important to me to specify what they named this MacGuffin of a substance. Unobtainium makes me kind of violent. In the movie, we follow Jake Sully, a Marine basically filling in for his twin brother, who is a scientist and died in like an accident or something. I don't know, it doesn't matter. Before the brother passed away, he had this really expensive alien avatar. Yeah, there it is! There it is! Body made for him, which he is supposed to use for the expeditions when exploring the planet. I guess because looking like them allows the Na'vi to be less on guard with the humans, which is understandable. So now, despite Jake's complete and utter lack of expertise and knowledge in literally any of the stuff relevant to this huge Pandora expedition thingy, he's recruited to join this insanely expensive space mission. Sure. So naturally, he ends up getting lost on Pandora during a field trip, because of course he does. He is then found by Neytiri, the daughter of the chief of the local Na'vi clan. She decides to take him in a way, following her initial hostility, because Awa seems to have given Jake's heart her approval, in the form of a little group hug from these pretty floating, jellyfish-looking alien thingies, which is a lovely concept, but is also just like insanely convenient for the plot. But you get distracted by the pretty visuals, which is just what keeps this movie going, really. Anyway, I had a whole page written out for this next section because it's like the rest of the movie, but basically I'm just going to summarize it down to this. Jake is sent to infiltrate the Na'vi and report back to the military guy. But he falls in love with the culture and with Neytiri and with the Na'vi. The colonizers decide to colonize and do violent things, and Jake abandons the colonizers and sides with the Na'vi because literally all they want is to be left alone to live the way they have been living at the place they spend their lives. Jake regains the trust of the Na'vi by taming Toruk, I think is how you say it, Toruk, a dragon bird that none of the Na'vi have been able to tame for generations. But somehow he can. We don't even really see him do it. Like, we see him, anyway, whatever. But because of that, Jake is able to bring the other clans together to fight the humans, and they win the battle, I think. I know they didn't lose, but I honestly can't remember how the triumph was like finalized. Jake decides to permanently reside within his avatar by doing a Na'vi ceremony, and that's it. That's the end till the next 400 sequels. Okay, now that that's out of the way and the like groundwork is kind of established, I'm gonna pivot a bit so we can discuss the crux of the video. What defines a human, and how do we take that away from others? It might seem obvious defining humanity, but the way we treat it, the way we deny it to others, and the way we sometimes seem to act in defiance of it while claiming to be defending it, makes it a little harder to succinctly state it into words. So I found a study, because that's my solution to everything. Actually, I found a bunch of studies and a book that discuss this very topic. For the study specifically, I'm going to quote them very briefly throughout this video because they use a lot of scientific jargon, and trust me, I almost fell asleep like 16 times doing the research for this. So I will try to keep the direct quotes to a minimum, and I'm gonna mostly stick with summarizing, but I will put the exact quote I am paraphrasing on the screen for reference, and I will leave my resources in the description. Uniquely human characteristics define the boundary that separates humans from the related category of animals, but humanness may also be understood non-comparatively as the features that are typical of or central to humans. These normative or fundamental characteristics might be referred to as human nature. Characteristics that are typically or essentially human, that represent the concept's core, may not be the same ones that distinguish us from other species. So the paper chooses to define it, in the scientific sense, as certain traits that indicate a higher level of cognition, such as language, refined emotion, and specific traits like being imaginative or intelligent. The common threads running through these proposals are cognitive sophistication, culture, refinement, socialization, and internalized moral sensibility. Defining humanity was the hardest part of this for me, because it is just so intangible, and I think a significant part of us is wired to believe that there is a metaphysical aspect to our humanity that can't be measured. Because, well, how do you define a soul? So, now that we got the scientific definition out of the way, or as close as we could get to a scientific definition, I am going to say that I honestly don't think that dehumanization as a concept can be limited to strict scientific terms. I think when we dehumanize, whether in media or in real life, we, in our own heads, choose to turn our humanity into something deeper, something neither measurable nor observable, making it almost mystical in nature. And then after envisioning this mystical quality that we assume we possess, we then choose to take it away from entire groups of people, wherever we see fit and wherever it benefits us. The fact that people sometimes believe that other people who appear human are really less than human illustrates something important about how the human mind works. It shows that we don't think that merely looking human is what makes a being human. Instead, think of humanness as something deeper that's inside of them, something more than the portions of the physical body that meets the eye. In our heads, we define humanity however we want, and we take it away from others however we want to, in the ways that are most convenient to us. Dehumanization isn't based on differences in appearance, language, religion, and so on. In fact, dehumanizers typically seek out or invent differences to support their projects. So it's not so much about the definition at all, really, as much as it ends up being about what we do when we convince ourselves that this intangible quality is missing, when we convince ourselves of its absence, of a lack of humanity, when we start perceiving others as imposters, as inhuman. These stories, Avatar and Tokyo Ghoul, while about other stuff, address the issue that intrinsically we know is always present when we ask, how could they? Or what made them do this? Or what got them to do this? And the people who know the answers to that, who know how to get us there, whether in fiction or in reality, always use that knowledge and our impressionability to their advantage, to serve their purposes, to ironically turn off the humanity in others, to allow them to attack and brutalize people who have been sold to them as less than human. Again, I don't know how to make quotation marks, it's really stressing me out. In Avatar, it's a little more simple and straightforward. It's built up throughout the whole movie in the conversations between the humans regarding the Na'vi, especially the ones that include the military personnel.
We have an indigenous population of humanoids called the Na'vi.
There are always moments, subtle dehumanizations that make it clear that they view them, the entire group, the entire species really, as less than us, inferior. Therefore they can be killed if needed. And of course, it is needed. Despite it being clear that the Na'vi possess the same intellectual prowess we do. They have their own language and can even learn others. In the movie they already know more English than Jake knows Na'vi. And despite them showing almost all the traits that you would define as human, in like the scientific definition I mentioned earlier, and them being even more spiritually elevated than us, when spirituality is considered one of the uniquely human characteristics defined earlier. Despite all that, they will still reduce them to animals when the time comes, when violence becomes a necessity to feed greed, when the human's humanity gets in the way of them getting what they want. They turn it off by finding whatever reasoning they need to justify their actions. Dehumanization is one way in which moral self-sanctions are selectively disengaged. People who aggress are spared self-condemnation and empathic distress if their identification with victims is blocked by seeing them no longer as persons with feelings, hopes, and concerns, but as subhuman objects.
Look, Sully, just find out what the blue monkeys want.
And it's often said in passing, cursory, always something small and subtle that can be easily dismissed. But just like in real life, this is repeated over and over, till the idea worms its way into your mind and settles there, till it's us versus them, and them is then reduced to an inferior entity, one that we do not owe the same moral obligations to as we do to our fellow man. Among these are ways that we have found to overcome our visceral aversion to performing acts of calculated, instrumental violence against our own kind. It's our feats of self-engineering that have made certain kinds of violence, by far the most destructive kinds of violence, possible. And while this is fiction, just like the Poppy War, but unlike Tokyo Ghoul, Avatar is very clearly inspired by real-life events. There's actually very little subtlety about it. It is inspired by real things that were done to real people, who are human beings just like us. And throughout this, you will see me accidentally say we and us when referring to the aggressors and to the victims. And I accidentally slip into personal pronouns when referring to human beings in general, and to our innate willingness to manufacture any excuse to morally absolve ourselves from certain actions that we know are wrong, but we also know would benefit us in some way. Imagine a world where there are non-human creatures that are disguised as humans. This would be strange and disturbing, and it would be even stranger and more disturbing if you believed that these pseudo-humans were malevolent entities bent on destroying true humans and everything they've achieved. This is not about Tokyo Ghoul. This is the preface from On Inhumanity, before introducing a passage from the Nazi propaganda booklet, The Subhuman. The rest of it actually goes like this. And this is the actual quote that paragraph was introducing. Again, I'm not going to read this out loud. Following this passage, On Inhumanity continues on into this paragraph. Just for a moment, ignore the historical context of this material, forget that it's Nazi propaganda, and just concentrate on the themes, as though it were a description of the plot of a movie. The story goes something like this. There is a horde of subhuman entities that pass themselves off as human beings. Although these evil and repulsive entities aren't human, they aren't mere animals either. There's something altogether different, something demonic or monstrous. Their mission is to take over the world and to destroy the human race. This sounds so much like Tokyo Ghoul, it actually kind of freaked me out. And the allegory, the metaphor here, the reference to what the ghouls represent isn't even imagined or forced or a reach. Ishida has stated in an interview before that he wanted to try something where the villains are part of the minority. Although to me, in Tokyo Ghoul, the ghouls stop being the villains pretty early on. Again, air quotes, the villains, air quotes, oh my god. But we'll get deeper into that in the next section. But Ishida also stated, maybe there's a part of me that sympathizes with the minority, which would explain why we don't completely end up hating the ghouls as you would with villains. Despite the fact that, of all the stories I've consumed that have any prevalence to the topic of this video, Tokyo Ghoul is the one most removed from reality. Its instances of showcasing dehumanization are still rooted in real human behavior. People actively avoid attributing secondary emotions to outgroups, discount evidence that outgroup members experience them. This reaction from the human in this scene, the ghoul investigator, to a woman, a mother, willingly and instinctually sacrificing her life for her child's, is so textbook dehumanization that when I read the earlier quote in the research paper, I immediately conjured up this manga panel in my head. Because secondary emotions, elevated emotions, things like self-sacrifice and altruism are things we like to attribute only to ourselves. Only we, only human beings, what we identify as human beings, are capable of such noble acts, such noble thoughts. And once we take humanity away from a group, we take this ability to be noble away from them too. No matter how much they display these traits right to our faces, we will deny them nobility and dignity. We will automatically expect ulterior motives, accuse them of pretending, or anything else that explains their actions to us without having us reevaluate our preconceptions of them. Why would someone be pretending when they're literally 2 seconds away from death? Who knows? And he doesn't care to find out. Tokyo Ghoul is also accurate down to the motivations. The reasons we act the way we act, the reasons we are capable of such horrendous things. Even that is portrayed accurately and well in the story's characters. We kill to save the world, to stamp out evil, to liberate, to keep us free. There are actually a lot more examples of interesting instances of dehumanization, and they actually go both ways, which is super interesting. That I got kind of overwhelmed trying to include them all. So just read the manga if you can, especially the original series. It's honestly really good and the art is incredible, and you'll see even more of why it's good in a second. So, while I focused in the previous section on exactly what dehumanization is and the way it's portrayed in both stories, for this section I'm going to focus on how such wildly different stories handle the same topic and the differences in their approach. Why is my voice so weird? I'm starting with Avatar again because it's just so simple. Avatar rooted itself in reality completely and irreversibly. Like, there are one-to-one connections between the movie and real-life groups, very clear ties and very little layers to the metaphor to shroud that. It's like history but with CGI and... For its story, it chose to take real atrocities, real violence, real massacres, and real dehumanization, and place them in a futuristic timeline. That's about it. So because that's where the narrative set itself up, I'm not gonna criticize the way it portrayed the two groups in terms of their conflict and its structure, because that's pretty much how things were in real life. The violence motivated by greed and entitlement, the dehumanization, the disregard of values and culture, all are pretty much historically accurate. So there's no criticism to be levied at it here. But while I'm not gonna criticize it for portraying history kind of accurately, I will criticize it a little for the choice it made to root itself so deeply in reality but not expand on anything further than has already been done before. For a movie that was so innovative with its technology and the way it used advancements to create a beautiful world and provide us with new imagery, it chose to use all that to sell a story that has been done a million times before, and a character that is so textbook white savior it's almost satirical. Like, even when retelling a story from history, there's definitely a new perspective that could have and should have been introduced. Dances with Wolves came out in 1990. There was plenty of time to expand at least the Na'vi beyond the stereotypical way in which indigenous cultures have been portrayed for decades. But it chose not to, which brings me to my second point. The myth of the noble savage. The modern myth of the noble savage is most commonly attributed to the 18th century Enlightenment philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He believed that the original man was free from sin, appetite, or the concept of right and wrong, and that those deemed savages were not brutal but noble. The article goes on to explain that following the colonization of indigenous lands, the idea of the noble savage was replaced with a stereotype on the opposite end of the spectrum, the negative stereotype of the dangerous, brutal savage, which is of course more harmful and far less rooted in reality. But again, viewing things through the lens of history allows us to see how stereotypes like that arise, why the people who colonized lands had to change the narrative, to excuse their actions, to justify their violence. Yet another version of the noble savage can be found in New Age romanticism. Indigenous peoples are credited with special powers, such as healing or enhanced spirituality. Now, at first glance, this may seem like a plus. It's better than the other one at least, far better, but it's also harmful. Scholars have long recognized that both the noble and the brutal savage are fantasies of the European mind that kept indigenous peoples in a suspended state of either elevated purity or perpetual evil. The noble savage binds indigenous peoples to an impossible standard. The brutal savage, by contrast, becomes the preemptive argument for indigenous failings. Because Avatar retells a story that has been told time and time again, with very little embellishments to the narrative aside from what the new futuristic setting requires. It does not expand on its indigenous tribe, the Na'vi, beyond the myth of the noble savage. They are yet again reduced to a European fantasy, united and saved by the white man in blueface. And for all the instances in which this movie portrayed the dehumanization that propels the military and the corporation to feel entitled to their land and to dismiss their sacred sites, the movie still has one fatal flaw because it partakes in their dehumanization in its own way. Just like the article said, the myth of the noble savage binds indigenous people to an impossible standard. It robs them of their humanity and turns them into an ideal. They are not allowed to err. They must be magical and spiritual and complacent until they are electrified back by their white leader, or else they do not fit said ideal and automatically revert to the opposite end of the spectrum. I think that this is where Avatar fails the most, both when it comes to the topic of this video and just as a story in general. Actually, Avatar also fails when it comes to character, especially Jake Sully, but I'll discuss him a bit more in a little. Now, on the other hand, Tokyo Ghoul is just all nuance. I've seen it often discussed that Tokyo Ghoul is a failed racial discrimination allegory, one that blames minorities for their own mistreatment. And I will say, I completely understand where that criticism would come from. I actually viewed it that way for a while too. Not only that, there's definitely reason out there to view it from that lens specifically. As this suggests, well, more like confirms, the ghouls are the minorities, but they are also quite dangerous, verifiably so. So fear of them is valid. But I think the best way to look at Tokyo Ghoul is just through its complete detachment from reality. It's not really like an allegory or a metaphor, not like a one-to-one one at least. One-to-one. This is a story that addresses multiple themes and ideas like the cyclical nature of violence and identity and, most importantly for this video, humanity. I think Tokyo Ghoul not being based in reality in any way allows it to deeply explore topics that it could not otherwise. It allows it to give things so much nuance and dimension. I know the quote says that he wanted a story where the minorities were the villains, and for the most part he's right. They are the minorities in this universe, and the nature in which they have to survive suggests an automatic villainous status, as there definitely is reason to fear them, as we said. But because they don't represent any specific minority, I think that's what allows the story to explore the depth of humanity and give both groups so much dimension that it makes the storytelling so much more unique and interesting. Like, the premise itself, where the ghouls are the minorities and they're dangerous, they're a threat, human beings are right to be afraid of them. Throughout history, when examining actual real-life instances of dehumanizing minorities, accusations of were the highest level of monstrosity we would levy at minority groups. In Tokyo Ghoul, the ghouls are already monsters. They're literally called ghouls. They're already not only do they feed on humans, they can only feed on humans. Until the fun little vegan fix they have at the end. I know it seems contrived, but I liked it because I needed some joy at the end of that. So it's fine. They are every nightmare, every dehumanization, every false claim that has been made to target a minority group and exterminate them turned into reality. And yet, despite what Ishida says, they're not the villains really. The goal of the story, the ending we want, is to allow them to live in peace. Throughout the story, we spend most of our time rooting for them, at least a group of them, not against them. They are humanity's entire roster of fears encapsulated into one being, including one of our biggest fears of having monsters that look and act just like us, indistinguishable from regular human beings. Also, regular is in air quotes. I don't know how to. I'm hoping I fix this in post and I don't have to keep including clips of me saying this is in air quotes. Anyway, monsters in disguise. And yet, we root for them to find a way to live peacefully. We don't want them wiped out. We don't want them exterminated. We want them to find their place, their peace, their harmony. So on the one hand, if this is looked at through the lens of them being like an actual representation of a minority, or of minorities in general, it's kind of messed up and makes the irrational fear of minorities seem valid. But again, I just don't see this as a one-to-one thing. The ghouls are not representing anyone in particular, and I think making them the personification of all of our worst fears, and then spending the majority of the narrative humanizing them, showing the purely human actions they take and the emotions they have, leads me to look at the way the representation is handled in this in a completely different light. Tokyo Ghoul takes the dangerous minority stereotype to its very extreme as it can make it, and still constantly reminds us that they are human while not actually being human. It is constantly reminding us that you can't just strip an entire group of their humanity. It allows them to have faults, to have flaws, to make mistakes, to be human. It allows some ghouls to be capable of extreme evil, just like things are in real life, where no group is made up entirely of saints. And yet, neither are the humans in the story. The humans in this lose their humanity constantly. They are capable of just as much evil, if not more. Capable of just as much destruction. And on both sides, to balance that out, we get the ones who lead with empathy and with compassion, who remind us that neither group is a monolith, and that both deserve to exist, to live. Another one of the reasons that I think Tokyo Ghoul manages to have more nuance and layers, and in turn deliver a message in a more effective way than Avatar, while being so detached from reality, is its protagonist. Both Ken Kaneki and Jake Sully are people torn between two worlds, two sides of their identity, two types of their humanity. But with Tokyo Ghoul, it's just so much better. I don't even know what to say. There really is no comparison here. Kaneki grappling with the two halves of him, coming to terms with the fact that he is both human and ghoul, is just so much more thoroughly explored and portrayed. And maybe this is an unfair comparison because Tokyo Ghoul gets 30 books, while Avatar gets one movie. But that's not entirely true either now, is it? Because A, that movie was 3 fucking hours long, and the part that would have been the best for building this dimensionality into Jake's character and the way he was torn between two identities was done in a montage set to a voiceover diary entry thingy, I don't know. In a 3-hour movie, you should not be allowed to have this kind of a cop-out in a movie that long. I really actually want to talk about why movies are just keep getting longer. I want to make a video essay about that, but I don't know how to research it. Anyway, let alone one that spanned so much of a character's growth and is fundamental for the decisions he makes at the climax of the movie. And not only that, but Cameron appears to have already had 50,000 sequels for Avatar planned in his head. It's like the world's slowest TV show, basically. They could have had time to explore Jake and actually make his character even remotely interesting. Because, to me, it's the weakest part of the movie. He is so unbelievably dull and uninteresting for someone who's meant to be representing a bridge of some sort or a schism. I don't know. These are opposite words. At least for a bit, he That's what he represents. His foundations are so unsound, the whole structure built on top of them is shaky and crumbling. I just think he's kind of a boring character. And the reason I'm going on about this so much is because Kaneki stands in the exact same position. He's torn, he also acts as a bridge of sorts, he's both human and ghoul, and we got to watch him too as he acclimates to the aspect of life that the audience is most unfamiliar with, introducing us to this whole world that is new to us as he gets introduced to it too. But in Kaneki, there is just so much more exploration of both aspects of him, both on a macro and on a micro scale. His thoughts and actions are torn, but the overarching storyline is also torn in half. With the first series being spent exploring his ghoul side while he's surrounded by ghouls and is getting familiar with that part of the world, meeting all kinds of ghouls, the good, the bad, the empathetic, the compassionate, the monstrous, all of them. And he spends the other series working amongst humans, mostly. And with his human side being in charge, giving us an even exploration of his entire identity, which allows us to see that, despite their differences, neither side is all good or all evil, and that the presence of bad ghouls doesn't mean that all ghouls are bad and that ghouls don't deserve to live. And the same for humans, obviously. It's just, in my opinion, so much more well done. And obviously I know like both stories are not the same and are not going to be focusing on the same narrative elements and all that, and like just because I am zeroing in on a specific concept doesn't mean that either had to cater to that concept specifically. But I honestly think in general the character building in Avatar was pretty garbage. I always have, like even before I started working on this. So when this essay had me comparing it to Tokyo Ghoul, which I think has some of the strongest character building, it was like a damn broke. Anyway, I got a bit off track here. I'm just gonna get into the conclusion because I don't know where I went with this and I don't know how to wrap it up at this point. I know I went off on a tangent at the end there, but the goal of this was not really to criticize either of them too much. I just found it really interesting how two wildly different stories had similar protagonists at their heart and included echoes of an issue that I'm constantly fascinated by. Explorations of humanity in art always fascinate me, especially when they delve into areas like dehumanization and the ways we weaponize our humanity and turn it into a way to justify atrocities rather than deterring from them. I think in art, we strive to see what our humanity looks like when it's dressed in a different skin, when it speaks a different language, because we are trying to understand the arbitrary boundaries that separate us. We are trying to understand where our compassion for others is able to stop and why, to grasp what the borders of our empathy look like. And I think that these two stories do a really good job expanding on these questions and exploring them in settings that are much more interesting than the mundanity of our everyday lives. And I believe that there are lessons to be taken from both of them, things that are worth exploring further, that could maybe shine a light on our own behavior, maybe help us see things from a different perspective, and maybe redefine for us what it truly means to be human. Okay, that's it. Thank you guys so much for watching. I don't know if anyone was like waiting for a video, but I'm really sorry this one took a while. I got sick in the middle of working on it, and I had to redo like a lot of stuff. Also, thank you so much for watching the last two videos and for anyone who subscribed and anyone who liked them and anyone who commented. I'm also following the suggestion that I should leave a Google form in the description so you guys can send me ideas for video essays and stuff if you want. Also, I'm going to try to make like a more realistic schedule so I can be consistent with it. I'll keep you guys posted on that. But I have already started working on the next video and it's going to be about yellow jackets. So hopefully that'll be done soon too. Okay, that's it. I'm done rambling. I hope you guys enjoyed this and please let me know what you thought. I love reading your comments. Thank you again so much for watching and I'll see you the next one. Bye!